Ray and Shirley Conan's 1967 travelogues are basically a masterclass in how to experience the world with your eyes wide open, capturing a moment in Italy that feels both remarkably distant and incredibly familiar. We're looking at a month-long trip they took in May of '67, and the level of detail is just vivid. It isn't just a list of monuments, it's the smell of coffee, the frustration of traffic, and the specific habits of a 10-year-old Apricot poodle in Rome.
It's the texture of the experience that stands out. When they arrive in Venice on May 19th, they're taking the boat from Piazzale Roma into the Old City, and Ray describes St. Mark's Square as teeming with thousands of pigeons. It's interesting because in 1967, feeding the pigeons was the quintessential tourist activity, often sponsored by insurance companies like Assicurazioni Generali, who would pour grain in the shape of their logo. For Ray and Shirley, it's this overwhelming, fluttering introduction to the heart of the Republic.
They dive straight into the history of the Doges, and I love the technical detail they noted about the Doge's palace. They saw these rooms, some 100 by 200 feet, without a single internal support column. Think about the engineering of that. Construction started around 8010 AD, and these massive spans were finished in the 1200s. It was the absolute seat of power, but Ray picks up on the unique political structure. The Doges weren't hereditary, it was never father to son. It was this complex, often secretive elective system designed to keep any one family from becoming a permanent monarchy.
And the contrast in that building is stark. One minute you're in these gilded halls, and the next you're crossing the Bridge of Sighs into the dungeons. They learned about the tiered misery there, the upper cells for common thieves, and the lower pozzi, or wells, for political prisoners. Those lower ones were notorious for flooding with the lagoon's water and being overrun by rats. They mention Giacomo Casanova as the only prisoner to ever escape, which is legendary. He actually broke through the lead-tiled roof, known as Piombi, back in 1756. Ray and Shirley are walking the exact path those prisoners took, feeling that shift from the Adriatic breeze to the damp dark.
There's a great sense of their daily rhythm, too. A glass-blowing demonstration, a lunch of spaghetti and fish washed down with Chianti, and then that gondola ride. But I'm struck by the smaller moments, like hunting for oranges later that night, because Greg had a cold. They're in one of the most romantic cities on Earth, and they're navigating closed department stores and side streets looking for vitamin C. It grounds the grandeur in real family life.
By the next day, May 20th, they're on a whistle-stop tour through Padua, Ferrara, and Bologna before hitting Florence. The traffic in Florence was apparently a nightmare even then. But what's really poignant is how Ray describes the city as feeling rushed and still showing deep scars from the flood. This is only 6 months after the Great Flood of November 1966. The Arno River had surged to heights of over 22 feet in the Santa Croce area. Ray mentions seeing the waterlines still visible on the buildings, some up to 23 feet high. The city was still literally drying out.
That explains the disappointment he felt. Florence wasn't the polished museum we see today. It was a recovery zone. Yet they still see the heavyweights. The Medici Chapel with Michelangelo's sculptures of night and day, and the Santa Croce where Michelangelo and Galileo are buried. But the story Ray tells about the Pietà in the Florence Cathedral, the one Michelangelo worked on when he was nearly 90, is fascinating. Michelangelo is supposedly so frustrated with the quality of the marble, or perhaps his own declining health, that he actually took a hammer to it. He broke off the arm of Christ and never finished the piece. It was meant for his own tomb.
It's a very human moment for a titan like Michelangelo. To see that unfinished quality next to the perfection of a copy of the David, which they also saw, creates this tension between the ideal and the reality of aging, and they notice the famous Ghiberti doors at the baptistery had pieces missing. During that 1966 flood, the force of the water actually ripped several panels off the gates of paradise. They weren't lost, fortunately, but they were in the middle of a massive restoration effort by the Mud Angels, those international volunteers who flocked to save Florence's art.
They escaped the traffic of Florence for the hills of Tuscany and Umbria on the 21st, passing Lake Trasimeno, which is this beautiful azure color, and heading into Assisi. Ray's note here is simple: loved Assisi and wished to stay longer. There's something about the peace of St. Francis's town that clearly resonated with them more than the urban chaos of Florence. They visited the basilica, saw the Giotto frescoes, and had a terrific meal at the Hotel Giotto, which has been overlooking that valley since 1899.
But the real highlight for me is how the day ends in Rome. They get stuck in another bad traffic jam and end up at a hotel on the outskirts that's barely finished. Unfinished drapery, towel racks missing. But the lobby offered free scotch to the first guests, so they clearly rolled with the punches. They take a limousine into town for 1,000 lire, which Ray notes was more expensive than their beds for the night, and they end up at this charming restaurant sharing a table with a couple from Milan.
This is where the Apricot poodle comes in. The couple had their 10-year-old dog at the table with them, and the dog was apparently a bit of a gourmet. He refused to touch his spaghetti unless it had a dusting of Parmesan cheese on top. It's such a quintessential Roman moment. Dogs in restaurants are totally normal there, but the idea of a poodle with a specific cheese preference is just hilarious. They're trading food samples and conversation with these strangers, and that's the heart of travel, isn't it? The connection over a shared plate and a picky dog.
It really is, and when you look at Ray and Shirley's background, you see why they appreciated these moments so much. They were survivors of World War II, people who had seen the world at its most fractured. They raised their family in Oak Park, Illinois, which was this very tight-knit community of veterans and friends in the 50s and 60s. Oak Park was a place of deep roots, but they clearly had this itch to see the world. This was just one of 5 major European trips they took together.
Eventually, they traded the near north side of Chicago for the Northwoods in Antioch Township. By the time their kids were growing up, that area had become real polka country, with friends just across the border in Wisconsin. It's a classic Midwestern arc, building a life in the suburbs, exploring the old world with curiosity and humor, and finally finding peace in the woods. These journals aren't just a travelogue, they're a record of 2 people who knew how to enjoy the journey, whether they were looking at a Michelangelo or an orange for a cold.
There's a warmth in Ray's writing that makes you feel like you're sitting in the back of that limousine with them, counting out lyre and laughing at a dog eating pasta. It's a reminder that the world is huge and historical, but it's also small enough to fit around a dinner table.
If you enjoyed this glimpse into Ray and Shirley's travels, share this episode with a friend who loves a good story.